Jesus tells us about two men. You know this story by now. Two men, two houses, one storm. The house built on sand collapses, and the house built on rock endures. We know this parable because it's in the Bible. Now, not everything is in the Bible. To say we only need the Bible is a heresy, promoted by men like Martin Luther and those who came after him. We need more than just the Bible. We need the full revelation of God. There are two kinds of revelation, public and private. Public revelation is also known as the deposit of faith. It is the teaching directly given to the church by Christ. Everything Christ taught, he said to the apostles, and they handed it on to the church. Some of it they wrote down, and that's the Bible. But they didn't write everything down. This is the tradition of the church, handed on from Christ to the apostles, and then to their successors, the bishops. Now, you're a good Catholic, and you know this, but do you know about private revelation? Private revelation doesn't mean no one knows about it. There are lots of private revelations it seems everyone knows about. Rather, it means it isn't public revelation. It is not part of the deposit of faith. It wasn't given to the church via the apostles while Christ was incarnate on the earth. Private revelation isn't binding on the faithful the way public revelation is. It's useful, but it's not essential. It doesn't define doctrine. What it does is help us better understand our faith. Private revelation usually takes the form of a vision or message from Christ or the Blessed Mother. You'll be familiar with the names of some of them, Fatima, Lourdes, the Divine Mercy, and you'll probably be familiar with false private revelations, Bayside, Medjugorje, Maria Divine Mercy, and Palmyra, New York. Not familiar with that one? Me neither until I read the script, but you will be soon. That is where Joseph Smith, founder of the Mormons, said he received his revelation of golden plates, which he translated by using a magic stone in a hat. Every single word of that sentence is what Mormons believe. It's no exaggeration to say Joseph Smith was one of the most interesting, colorful, and just plain weird figures in early 19th century America. He was born in Vermont in 1805, but by 1817, his family had moved to western New York State, an area influenced by something called the Second Great Awakening. This was a powerful revival movement. Now, in our modern secular culture, where religion is a punchline rather than something important, this might be hard to understand, but try to imagine it. A great movement sweeping the land, a restoration, a revival of religious fervor and belief. Preachers traveled from town to town. People converted or became more passionate about their faith. We might think this is a good thing, but in America, the land of freedom of religion, these revivals are usually miniature Protestant revolts. Joseph Smith's family were caught up in the religious excitement of the Second Great Awakening. They engaged in folk magic, a kind of semi-Christian superstition. This was common in the time, but this, along with the fact that his parents and grandfather claimed to receive divine visions, set the stage for what was to come. One of the folk magic things they did was treasure seeking. Now remember, this is 1823. No metal detectors, no fancier machinery. So you might think that Smith just rolled up his sleeves and set a shovel on his shoulder and went out into the field and just started digging. Oh yeah. Oh no, you'd be wrong about that one. Oh, so wrong. He looked into a magical seer stone. Smith said he could find buried treasure by looking into a magical stone. Yep. And people were weak-minded enough to believe him and actually hired him. This was actually pretty common at the time. I suppose we shouldn't be too surprised. How many people today visit psychics or read horoscopes or other things like that? Still, the government took a dim view of him fleecing people of their money. Perhaps they didn't like the competition. He was brought up on a charge of being a disorderly person. It's not clear what the results of that case were. There are contradictory accounts, but it was clear his glass-looking wasn't highly regarded, especially by his future father-in-law. In 1826, the same year as he was brought up on charges of, and I want to emphasize this, looking into a rock and saying he knew where buried treasure was like a low-budget version of the Goonies, he began courting a young lady called Emma Hale. Emma's father wanted, as all fathers do, his daughter to marry someone who was a good man, a successful man, and who specifically did not earn a living by looking at rocks. Still, Smith was clearly persuasive, and he and Emma eloped and were married in early 1827. It was at this point the story gets really interesting and really weird. It was about this point Smith claimed that in 1820, about 7 years before, he had received a religious vision. While praying in a wooded area near his house, God told him his sins were forgiven and that all modern churches had turned aside from the gospel. He also said that about 3 years after this, in 1823, he was praying one night and received a second vision. An angel named Moroni visited him and told him where a book made of golden plates was buried, together with 2 seer stones, which would allow him to translate the book. Smith said he went and found the golden plates, but could not remove them because the angel would not let him. He said he went back to the plates over the next 4 years, visiting them for the last time with Emma in late 1827, and this time taking them away and putting them in a locked chest. Smith said the angel told him to show the plates to no one, convenient, but instead to publish a translation. Now, let's take a brief sidebar here. You might be wondering, why is Charlie telling this out of order? I mean, we started with Smith as a boy in Vermont and then moved to New York and his treasure hunting during the mid-1820s. But when we jump back to him being a boy in the early 1820s and getting a vision, surely the vision thing kind of is important and Charlie should have mentioned it then. My response is, surely the vision thing is kind of important and Joseph Smith should have mentioned it then. But he just didn't. There's no reliable record of him saying anything about any vision, angel, or golden plates before the late 1820s. And that's kind of a big deal, because a vision should be a big deal. It's not something you just don't mention. It's not something you forget about for 7 years. Unless, of course, you made it up later because you had a cunning plan to take advantage of the wave of religious fervor sweeping the nation. I mean, for example, let's just say you were a guy whose family had a history of folk magic and you'd engage in charlatanry by treasure seeking, and you were clearly silver-tongued enough to persuade a woman to marry you over her father's objections, and for various people to give you money and help you get started in various businesses. Just saying. Anyway, one of the guys who Smith persuaded to give him money was a neighbor in New York, Martin Harris. Smith moved to Pennsylvania in late 1827. In early 1828, Harris followed him. It was here Smith started the work of translating the golden plates. For the first few months, he worked with Harris. Smith dictated the translation to Harris, who wrote it down. Harris didn't exactly get a warm, fuzzy feeling about all this. The whole thing seemed kind of weird to him, and his wife was very skeptical. Harris asked Smith if he could take the manuscript back home to New York to show his family. Smith let him. Harris lost the manuscript. Some sources say his wife lost it in the fireplace. She was so upset at the false religious content of the manuscript, she just straight up set it on fire. Smith was pretty angry, obviously. He claimed that because of the loss of the manuscript, the angel punished him by taking away the golden plates and removing his ability to translate them. This period lasted until 1829, when he found a new man to act as his scribe, Oliver Cowdery. He carried on with the translation, but the bit he'd translated already was translated differently this time. Apparently, according to Smith, that translation had been flawed and corrupted, which was why it was lost and destroyed. How convenient. And just how did Smith make this translation? Well, let's turn to the words of a prominent early Mormon. These words are directly from an important member of the cult Smith started. Smith put the seer stone into a hat and put his face in the hat, drawing it closely around his face to exclude the light. And in the darkness, the spiritual light would shine. A piece of something resembling parchment would appear, and on that appeared the writing. One character at a time would appear, and under it was the interpretation in English. Brother Joseph would read off the English to Oliver Cowdery. Thus, the Book of Mormon was translated by the gift and power of God. He put a stone in a hat and put his face in the hat and said words, and someone wrote them down. I don't speak any languages except American, but even I know that isn't how you translate something. The translation was completed in 1829, and the Book of Mormon was published in 1830. Shortly after, Smith and a small group of followers organized into a church. The fledgling community was not highly regarded. People remembered Smith from his treasure hunting days and actually formed a genuine angry mob, which Smith and the Mormons had to flee from. Smith claimed he would lead them to the promised land in Missouri, and so they set off, traveling through Ohio. But it wasn't all smooth sailing for Smith. In a turn of events, even a man without a magical stone in a hat should have seen it coming. Some of his senior followers claimed to have visions of their own. Smith put a stop to this with a new revelation which declared that only he had the keys of the mysteries and the revelations, and only he could create scripture for the Mormons. This kind of convenient revelation is going to be a recurring theme if it hasn't already seemed to be a recurring theme. Smith and the Mormons arrived in Ohio in 1831. They stayed there for the next 7 years, getting many converts, developing doctrine with further revelations, and gathering a lot of political power. The people of Ohio didn't take kindly to this, and more angry mobs attacked the Mormons. Smith was actually tarred and feathered. I didn't even think that happened outside of the movies. Anyway, toward the end of his time in Ohio, Smith's reputation suffered. Suffered even more than the time they poured hot pitch on him and made him look like a chicken. The Mormons were deeply in debt, hounded by creditors, and Smith himself was accused of an adulterous relationship. Things came to a head in 1837 when Smith started a bank. He encouraged Mormons to invest in it, but the bank failed, taking people's savings with it. A warrant was issued for Smith's arrest on a charge of banking fraud, and he fled to Missouri in early 1838. Missouri might love company, but it didn't love the Mormons. Smith felt in danger, and after his experience of mob violence, remember, tarred and feathered here, decided to make threatening speeches trying to discourage people from attacking the Mormons. This went about as well as you might expect. The tensions grew, and another angry mob tried to stop Mormons voting. And this kicked off a so-called Mormon War of 1838. Mormons attacked the state militia, and the governor ordered the Mormons be exterminated or driven from the state. The Mormons surrendered and were ordered to give up their property and leave Missouri. Smith himself was charged with treason and sentenced to be executed. But the man charged with the execution had once been Smith's lawyer. Perhaps thinking attorney-client privilege meant you don't kill him, he refused to carry out the order. Smith was in jail for several months until he and other prominent Mormons escaped, probably with the help of the guards. Expelled from Missouri, Smith led the Mormons to the town of Nauvoo in Illinois where, much like Calvin in Geneva, he came to dominate the city both spiritually and politically. He was able to portray the Mormons as an oppressed minority and gather a lot of sympathy. He became the commander of the Nauvoo Legion, the state's largest group of armed men. It was during the time in Illinois that the Mormons' most controversial doctrines were created. Again, all of them through convenient revelation Smith received. The two best known are baptism of the dead and polygamy, or plural marriage. Prominent men in the Mormons used the latter to, well, I think you can guess. It was perhaps this kind of thing that turned popular opinion against Smith and the Mormons. His bodyguard was accused of shooting the governor of Missouri, and they tried to have him extradited there. He was arrested but rescued before he could be taken across the state line. In 1843, Smith asked Congress to make Nauvoo an independent territory, with the right to federal troops to defend it. When presidential candidates didn't say they would protect the Mormons, he said he would run for president himself. But time was running out for Smith. There were divisions within the Mormons. He proposed marriage to other men's wives and also changed the Mormons' doctrines. This was nothing new, of course, but members of the church didn't like it. In 1844, they attacked Smith, saying what seems obvious to us, that Smith was using polygamy to get himself a harem of women. Smith feared, perhaps with good reason, an angry mob would form, and so he mobilized the Nauvoo Legion and declared martial law. Illinois didn't take kindly to this and told the Mormons to knock it off or they would call out the army. Nauvoo surrendered without a fight, and Smith was arrested on a charge of treason. He was never brought to trial. The final angry mob of his career stormed the jail where he was held and broke into his cell. Smith tried to flee out of a window, but he was shot several times and died. And that's the tale of Joseph Smith. The story of the Mormons, however, continues after this. Their journey to Utah, battles and fights and disagreements, conflicts with the American government, but Joseph Smith's life is really the instructive thing here. And what is the lesson of the Mormons? What can we as Catholics learn? Firstly, we have to be ready to address their claims. Although Smith's life reads like some kind of crazy Wild West movie, and it's easy to make fun of him for putting his face in a hat and saying he's getting messages from God, and his history in the Book of Mormon is clearly made up, and their doctrines change with not only the whims of the cult leader, but also the demands of the federal government, a lot of people believe it. Mormonism is almost mainstream in America. You probably know a Mormon or two. Maybe they've come to your door. You need to be able to address the specific theological and historical problems with Mormonism. And we have a program to help you do just that. Our Basic Training Apologetics series has a whole episode and a load of articles and resources to help you address Mormonism and their crazy theology directly. And I'm not going to get into how to argue against Mormonism. That's for what the program is for. But that's not the main lesson here for us Catholics. Joseph Smith was successful because he was charismatic, able to spin a good story, portrayed himself as a persecuted man bringing a truth others were trying to hide, who existed during a time of spiritual upheaval. He claimed to have revelations from God and encouraged people to give their allegiances to him rather than anyone else. When people argued against him, he came up with new revelations and turned his followers against them. And this is the pattern and model for all false apparitions. The Catholic Church has a process, a slow, deliberate, even frustrating process by which she determines if a revelation is genuine or not. It can and does take years, but we must respect that process. Christ built one house on rock, but the singularity of that house isn't what I want to focus on. It is the houseness of it. Christ said a house divided against itself cannot stand, which means we have to obey what the house says. We have to respect the rules of the house rules, its decisions and laws, even if they are frustrating, even if we think we know better. You may know a Mormon, but I'm going to bet you definitely know a Catholic who supports a vision the church hasn't approved, maybe even messages the church has actively condemned. Maybe this person or people because it's pretty common. Maybe they support a true revelation but interpret in a way contrary to the church, or follow a disobedient priest who does so. Private revelation is attractive. It is a secret shared only by a few. It seems to explain the problems in the church, or spread gossip about why things are going badly. It often encourages us to do good things, pray, fast, attend Mass. Perhaps people even convert because of a false revelation. But that means nothing more than the fact that God can make good of anything. He used Pilate and Judas to bring about the crucifixion, the event which saved us all. He can certainly use a charlatan or three who say they can get messages from the Virgin Mary on a regular schedule. But it doesn't mean the revelations are true or that we should follow them. What they encourage, always encourage, is disobedience to the church. The church was founded by Christ as a means of our salvation, not just the sacraments or the faith or the moral teachings, but the church as an institution. She is our mother, and we must obey her. Nothing which tells us to disobey her can come from God. That's all for this time. Next time, on the last episode, although probably not the last false religion, I'm sure. We'll be talking about William Booth and the Salvation Army. Until then, stay obedient and holy, my friends. I'm Charles Hornbacher, and this has been Houses Built on Sand.